You've probably driven past a house like it before. White columns, a wraparound porch, trimmed hedges, the American dream made brick and mortar. To the town of Willow Creek, Ohio, the Ellison mansion was exactly that. A dream, a symbol of generosity, of grace, of good people doing good things. Edward and Lillian Ellison were the kind of couple who made headlines for endowing scholarships, who brought casseroles to church picnics, who smiled perfectly in every local paper. They hosted Easter egg hunts on their sprawling lawn, Christmas carol nights by candlelight, and over 12 quiet years, they adopted 9 little girls. 9 girls, each without birth certificates, each never seen enrolling in school, each kept mostly out of sight. This is the story of the Ellisons. But it is not a story of generosity. It is not a story of love. This is a story of ritual, of delusion, of cruelty dressed in silk and social graces. Behind the lace curtains and manicured hedges was a house of silence, a house of fear. They were respected, connected, untouchable, for years, until they weren't. What began as whispers from neighbors, "Why are the girls always inside? Why does Lillian never let anyone near them?" turned into suspicion, then investigation, then something much darker than anyone in Willow Creek was prepared to see. Hidden rooms, diaries written in symbols, girls who spoke in fractured memories, if they spoke at all, and bodies, so many bodies. This isn't just a true crime case. This is a failure of every system meant to protect the innocent. A tragedy not just of violence, but of silence. We uncover stories too dark to be comfortably remembered, tales where truth was buried alongside the victims. This might be the worst of all. If you haven't already, subscribe and join us each week as we shed light on the shadows history would rather forget. Bika used the Ellisons' war smiles, but built something monstrous, and it was hiding in plain sight. Willow Creek isn't the kind of place that makes national news. Tucked between endless fields and 2-lane highways, it's a quiet Ohio town with 1 post office, 2 churches, and just under 2,500 residents. People know their neighbors here. They wave from porches. They attend the same Sunday service their grandparents did. So when Edward and Lillian Ellison moved into the old Whitmore estate in the spring of 1982, people noticed. The mansion had sat empty for years, 3 stories of colonial grandeur, white stone columns, black shutters, and the creaking echo of wealth that had long since moved elsewhere, until the Ellisons arrived. Then the lights came back on. Edward was a man of few words but many assets, a real estate magnate who made millions buying distressed properties during the 1970s recession. Polished, polite, and impossibly sharp, he always looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine ad for trust funds and cigars. Lillian, on the other hand, was warmth incarnate, or so it seemed. A former social worker with an air of motherly calm, always smiling, always dressed modestly, always carrying a basket of something homemade when she visited the church or town hall. Together, they were an ideal, a couple who had done well and wanted to give back. They had no children of their own, a fact Lillian often lamented in quiet, mournful tones over tea at charity luncheons. "We tried," she would say, "but it wasn't God's plan for us, so we've opened our hearts in another way." And when the adoptions began, it felt, at first, like a miracle. Sarah came first in 1984, then Emily, Laura, Abigail, Hannah. One by one, the girls arrived, each shy, each small, each seemingly rescued from some unnamed hardship. The town applauded. The Ellisons were angels, heroes. Mary Thompson, their neighbor, said it best. They were so charming, always hosting fundraisers. You'd never suspect. Well, Who would? But the oddities came early. The girls were never enrolled in Willow Creek Elementary. No one ever saw them at the grocery store or the 4th of July parade. The Ellisons said they were homeschooled, protected. And in a place like Willow Creek, people rarely asked more than once. They had no reason to, until the questions could no longer be ignored. At first, people admired the Ellisons' growing family. Then they began to whisper. It wasn't just that Edward and Lillian adopted 9 girls between 1984 and 1996. It was how quickly it happened, and how quietly. No paperwork ever seemed to pass through Willow County Court. No baby showers, no social workers coming or going, just new faces appearing behind frosted windows and vanishing just as quickly. Sarah came in 1984, a thin girl with downcast eyes. Emily followed in 1985, then Laura in 87. Abigail, Hannah, Ruth, Naomi, Esther, and finally Grace. By 1996, the Ellisons' family portrait looked like something out of a vintage storybook. 9 pale girls in matching navy dresses standing perfectly still in front of the mansion's iron gate. Except, no one in town ever actually saw that photo taken. It appeared once in the Willow Creek Gazette, and never again. There were no birth certificates, not one. But Edward had money, and Lillian had charm. Together, they had influence. Local agencies bent the rules. State departments looked the other way. Who questions a donor who just paid for a new church roof? Who investigates a woman who once worked in social services and claims to be rescuing lost children? Still, cracks began to form. Laura's accident in 1989 was the first real warning. She fell, according to Lillian, from the second-story balcony while playing. But no ambulance was called, no ER visit, just a neighbor, Jane Carter, who remembered hearing the scream and seeing Laura limping days later, her leg wrapped in what looked like torn bedsheets. She said she'd fallen, Jane later told investigators, but Lillian wouldn't let anyone near her, said she was healing naturally, that God would provide. Then there was Dr. Rachel Patel, a pediatrician from Columbus who briefly consulted on a state referral. She noticed bruises on Emily's back, defensive bruises. When she filed a concern with Child Protective Services, they never followed up. They told me the Ellisons were upstanding, that I must have misunderstood, Dr. Patel later testified. But I didn't misunderstand. I saw fear in that child's eyes. Still, nothing happened. The girls remained locked behind those grand walls, out of school, out of reach, out of sight. And what the town didn't see, or refused to see, was about to become impossible to ignore. The first time Linda Harper visited the Ellison home, she left with a knot in her stomach that never quite untied. It was 1994. Linda was a counselor at Willow Creek Community School, newly appointed to a local review board for homeschooling compliance. The Ellisons, ever polished, welcomed her inside with tea and smiles, but it wasn't their hospitality that stayed with her. It was the silence. 9 girls in one house, and yet the halls were still. No laughter, no movement, just the slow tick of a grandfather clock and Lillian's voice, soft as syrup, explaining that, "The girls are studying upstairs, dear. They're very disciplined." Linda wasn't convinced. She noticed how Sarah flinched when Lillian reached to straighten her collar, how the youngest girl, Grace, avoided eye contact entirely, and how the 3rd floor, accessed by a narrow staircase, was locked, its knob scratched and scuffed. She documented everything, the hesitations, the locked doors, the strange symbols etched onto a wooden banister. Her report, filed with the state, went nowhere. Around the same time, Linda's husband, Robert Harper, a small-town journalist with a history of challenging quiet corruption, had begun investigating illegal adoption practices in Ohio. He noticed something odd in the timeline. Several missing children from nearby counties vanished within months of the Ellisons' adoptions. None of them reported beyond local bulletins. Immigrant girls, foster kids, runaways. Then came Elena Ruiz, a former nanny who worked briefly for the Ellisons in the early 90s. Elena left suddenly and never spoke publicly until Robert tracked her down. Her testimony cracked everything open. "They never let me stay past 6 p.m., she told him. The girls had strict routines, no eye contact, no speaking unless spoken to. But it was the attic. I heard things from there, crying, chanting, footsteps when no one was supposed to be up there." She mentioned rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. A leather-bound book Lillian often carried, filled with symbols and Latin phrases. And one night, Elena claimed she saw Edward leading a girl, one she didn't recognize, up the attic stairs. The girl never came back down. The turning point came in 1996. Acting on Robert and Linda Harper's mounting evidence, state police issued a warrant. What they found shattered the town's illusion. Behind the third-floor door were two girls, Rosa and Maria Lopez, starved, barely clothed, huddled in a room without windows, chained to an iron-frame bed, and in a locked chest nearby, they found Lillian's journal. Its first line read, "9 are chosen, the rest are vessels." The Ellison mansion became a crime scene overnight. The manicured hedges were taped off, news vans rolled down Willow Creek's peaceful lanes, and neighbors stood in their driveways in silent disbelief. Everyone had known Edward and Lillian, or thought they had. Detective James Larson was assigned to lead the investigation, a seasoned officer with a reputation for persistence, but even he wasn't prepared for what they would find. The girls, Rosa and Maria Lopez, were hospitalized immediately. Malnourished, bruised, and nearly nonverbal, they flinched at every question. But over time, fragments began to surface. They were not part of the Ellisons' known adopted children. There were no records of them anywhere. They hadn't been enrolled in school. They weren't even referred to by name in Lillian's journal. They were only called vessels. Larson began to read through the journal in stunned silence. It was over 300 pages, part delusion, part doctrine. Lillian had created her own system of belief, blending misread theology, obscure occult writings, and her own handwritten liturgy. She believed in redeemable girls, those who could be purified and made whole. But that process, she wrote, required transference. The pain, the sin, the shame, those had to be moved somewhere. That's what the vessels were for. Within a week, detectives searched every Ellison property. There were 5 in total: the main mansion in Willow Creek, a farmhouse in Indiana, a cabin in rural Michigan, a lakeside house in Pennsylvania, and a private rental in upstate New York. At the Indiana property, beneath a dilapidated barn, cadaver dogs found the first remains. 4 shallow graves. One child was identified immediately, Sophia Torres, reported missing in 1989 after leaving a youth shelter in Cleveland. Then Aisha Khan, a foster child from Toledo. The others were more difficult. No dental records, no fingerprints. One was later identified as Mei Chen, a girl who vanished during a failed asylum process. All were under 13 years old when they died. All bore signs of prolonged abuse. Larson's team soon recovered 5 more bodies from the Michigan and Pennsylvania sites. One girl had been buried with a scrap of ribbon. Another clutched a handmade doll. Edward Ellison claimed to know nothing, that Lillian had acted alone, that he was unaware of the upstairs activities. But the journal contained his initials, and Rosa, in a whisper, told a nurse, "Mr. Ellison, he picked who stayed and who disappeared." When the headlines faded and the trials began, the public turned its attention to the Ellisons. But those who truly understood the depth of what had happened looked to the girls. The 9 adopted children, and once seen as a symbol of Edward and Lillian's benevolence, were now survivors of psychological warfare. They had been paraded as redeemable, yet lived under constant threat of becoming vessels themselves. Some had already disappeared. Laura, the 3rd child, vanished from public view in 1991. Lillian told neighbors she'd been sent to a special boarding school in Vermont. No such enrollment was ever found, and her name appeared only once in Lillian's journal under a cryptic note. The ritual failed. Her spirit resisted. Do not attempt again with the 8th. Sarah, the eldest, attempted suicide in 1998. She had been living in a state-run care facility since the arrests. According to a former staff member, Sarah would wake up screaming at night, reciting long passages from Lillian's journal, verbatim. She said the house was still with her, that her mind was never quiet. Emily, the 2nd adopted daughter, agreed to be interviewed in 2003 under strict anonymity. Her voice was flat, calculated, every word chosen carefully. "We were told we were chosen," she said, "that we were being saved, but the rules always changed. If you smiled too long, if you spoke too loud, if you looked at someone the wrong way, you could be replaced." She described being made to kneel for hours while Lillian recited from her journal, drawing symbols on their foreheads in oil. And Edward, she said, would watch, silent, observing, always present, always deciding. Of the original 9 girls, only 5 could be located after the arrests. 3 were placed in long-term psychiatric care. 1, Ruth, lives under witness protection after assisting in the prosecution. In the aftermath of the Ellison case, as headlines moved on and news vans disappeared from Willow Creek streets, a quieter reckoning began. How could this happen for over a decade in plain sight? The answer, one that hurt more than any single crime, was this: the system failed because the system trusted appearances. The Ellisons weren't just wealthy, they were connected. Edward served as a silent donor to the county's judicial re-election campaigns. Lillian had ties to half the social workers in Central Ohio through her former position at the Department of Child Welfare. And when paperwork went missing or simply never existed, no one asked why. The county clerk who filed the Ellisons' first 3 adoptions, Margaret Bell, later testified that she received verbal authorizations to bypass standard protocols. When asked who gave them, she went silent. "That's just how it worked," she said. Child Protective Services received 7 separate tips between 1986 and 1994, all flagging concerning behavior at the Ellison residence. Not one was followed up with an in-person visit. The agency later admitted that Lillian's credentials as a former CPS worker gave her an internal assumption of credibility. Even medical professionals felt powerless. Dr. Rachel Patel's 1989 report of bruising on Emily's body was marked non-urgent and closed within 30 days, without contact. When questioned years later, Patel said, "They told me I didn't understand the family dynamic, that some children bruise easily. I knew it was a lie, but they made me doubt myself." The Homeschool Oversight Board in Willow Creek was composed of 3 members, all personal acquaintances of the Ellisons. Linda Harper, who briefly served with them, recalled being sidelined after asking about locked rooms. "They told me I was overreacting, that Lillian was a better mother than most. And the townspeople? They had our own guilt to wrestle with. A culture of politeness, a fear of seeming intrusive, an unwillingness to question a couple who threw the best Christmas parties and donated to the fire station. Detective Larson summarized it best during a press conference. We failed these girls, not just the police, not just CPS, all of us. We looked at a big house, clean clothes, and smiling photographs, and we saw what we wanted to see. Meanwhile, the girls were screaming behind locked doors no one tried to open. The Ellisons built their horror on silence, and silence, well-fed and well-dressed, is a hard thing to recognize as evil. The deeper investigators went into Lillian Ellison's writings, the clearer it became. This wasn't just abuse. It was a belief system, constructed, nourished, and obeyed inside the walls of the Ellison home, a theology of pain. Lillian's journal, seized during the 1996 raid, was more than a diary. It was a doctrine. Handwritten in ink, spanning nearly 2 decades, its contents were chillingly meticulous, outlining rituals, rankings, symbols, and the distinction between what she called redeemables and vessels. Each adopted girl was labeled a redeemable, chosen to be purified through strict discipline, religious recitation, and ritual isolation. But that purification came at a cost. The vessels, often undocumented immigrant children or runaways, were used to absorb the moral stains of the redeemables through what Lillian called transference rites. There was no known tradition that matched Lillian's system. It wasn't satanic. It wasn't Christian. It was her own hybrid of borrowed superstition, personal trauma, and psychological illness. Dr. Clara Nguyen, who reviewed the journal and testified at Edward's trial, described it as a closed loop of madness. Lillian created a cosmology where suffering was currency, where the innocent had to endure pain so others could be cleansed. But it was arbitrary, cruelty masquerading as structure. The journal included schedules, when girls were to fast, when they were to be evaluated, when rituals would occur. Some entries read like scripture. The vessel is the sponge, the sin taker, the bruised lamb. It must not speak, only carry. Pain is its offering. Others hinted at darker acts. Too much sin from Ruth today. Her anger bled into grace. Correction was administered. The vessel weeps, but that means it is working. It became clear Lillian saw herself as a priestess of some sacred order, administering what she believed were spiritual treatments. She referred to herself only as the matron in later entries. Investigators found small altars in several rooms of the mansion, candles, childlike drawings altered with red ink, a box containing the clipped hair of 5 different girls, and in one attic crawlspace, symbols drawn in ash on the floor. Neighbors would later swear they heard nothing, saw nothing, but some admitted to hearing faint music at night, a slow, rhythmic chant. "We thought they were just religious," said one neighbor. "Private, weird maybe, but who would think this?" Lillian's madness was orderly. That's what made it so dangerous. It wasn't chaos. It was doctrine. By the time detectives finished combing through Lillian's journals and property records, they realized something horrifying. The Ellison mansion was only one piece of a larger geography of secrecy. Edward, ever methodical, had quietly purchased multiple properties over the span of a decade. Not in his name, of course, but through shell companies, trusts, and false ownership transfers. Most of them were in rural, isolated areas, abandoned cabins, decrepit farmhouses, structures that looked forgotten on the outside and were never meant to be found. The first site uncovered was in rural Indiana, a crumbling barn set far off a dirt road surrounded by forest. It was there cadaver dogs first located remains, 4 graves, carefully spaced, shallow. Among the buried were Sofia Torres and Aisha Khan, identified through missing persons reports cross-referenced with bone DNA. The other two, girls between the ages of 8 and 12, remain unidentified to this day. Inside the barn, the floor had been torn up and resealed. Underneath it, investigators found remnants of ritual activity, a scorched copper bowl, a rusted chain bolted to the wall, and a partially burned journal fragment with these words, "We offer her pain so that the rest may be lifted." The second property, in northern Michigan, was even more remote. A single-room cabin, windowless. In a corner, a cot. In the center, a makeshift altar. Beneath the floorboards, 2 more children were buried, one with broken ribs, the other clutching a small wooden cross. The third site, a lakeside retreat in Pennsylvania, had been cleaned out, emptied months before the Ellisons were arrested. But behind a panel in the basement, they found what appeared to be a room for observation. One-way glass, audio equipment, and 9 VHS tapes. The labels were cryptic. Transfer A. Redemption Ruth. Failing vessel number 3. Prosecutors never released the contents of the tapes publicly, but Detective Larson, who viewed each one, later stated, "You don't forget what you see in those. You don't sleep the same. It wasn't just abuse. It was doctrine, ritualized and repeated, and Edward was present in every frame." The Ellisons' reach went beyond Willow Creek. This wasn't a single house of horror. It was a network of silence, of carefully chosen, deliberately hidden spaces, places where pain could be delivered and buried. Maps were drawn, dig teams sent out, but for every site uncovered, there were whispers of more. Lillian's journals hinted at farther sanctuaries, but no records remain, just the dirt, and what they chose to hide in it. By 1997, the Ellison case was no longer just a local horror. It had become a national trauma. But those who were closest to it, those who stepped foot inside the attic, who opened shallow graves with their own hands, who read the journal line by line, they bore scars no one could see. Detective James Larson, the lead investigator, was known for his composure. He had handled violent homicides before, but nothing prepared him for what he found at the Ellison properties. Years later, during a rare interview, he admitted, "You can't unhear children screaming on a tape. You can't unsee a girl's room where the walls are covered in prayers written in her own blood. After this case, I couldn't even walk past a swing set without seeing their faces." He took early retirement in 2001, quietly, no press, no statement. He now volunteers at a shelter for abused children, but he never speaks publicly about the Ellisons anymore. Robert Harper, the journalist who helped break the case, fared no better. His reporting had forced law enforcement into action, but the cost was personal. His wife, Linda Harper, the school counselor who had first raised concerns, was targeted by hate mail and conspiracy theorists. Some accused her of exaggerating the girl's conditions. Others accused her of being part of it. Their marriage strained. Linda left Willow Creek in 2000 and now lives under a different name. Robert continued to publish until 2005 when he released his final article, a haunting reflection titled "The House That Swallowed Silence." In it, he wrote, "There is a weight that settles on you when you look too long into madness. The Ellisons didn't just manipulate a system. They reshaped reality for those girls, and for those of us who found them. Reality never felt safe again." Elena Ruiz, the former nanny, entered witness protection after the trial. She never returned to public life. And Todd, the forensic team who examined the burial sites, requested mental health services en masse. One technician, when asked what disturbed her most, said simply, "The dolls, the way they were positioned, like they were still playing." or praying. Trauma seeped into every part of the case. Even the archivists who logged the Ellison journals requested transfers. It wasn't the gore. There wasn't much of it. It was the intention, the calm, methodical belief that what they were doing was necessary. That's what broke them. Laura was the third child adopted by the Ellisons. She arrived in 1987, quiet and pale, with long black hair and a permanent look of caution in her eyes. For a time, she was seen occasionally in town, clutching Lillian's hand at the church bake sale or peeking from behind Edward's leg during community events. But by 1991, she vanished. The official story was that Laura had been enrolled in a boarding school in Vermont for gifted girls. Lillian told anyone who asked that Laura had always been special, brilliant, sensitive, in need of structure. When pressed for the school's name, Lillian would smile gently and say, "Oh, they're very private. It's a spiritual retreat, really, not the kind of place you look up in a phone book." No school was ever found. Her name vanished from public records. Her bedroom in the Ellison house had been repurposed into a reading room when police searched the home in 1996. No photos of her after age 10 were ever recovered. It was as if she had simply dissolved. But then came the journal. Laura's name appeared only 3 times in over 300 pages. Once, early on, listed with the other redeemables. Once with a cryptic warning. Laura resisted transference. Vessel 2 became unstable. Watch for signs of collapse. And finally, a line that chilled every investigator who read it. The ritual failed. The spirit remained fractured. Do not attempt again with the 8th. Laura was the 3rd child, but Lillian referred to her as the 8th. Some interpreted this as a reordering of the girls by ritual ranking, not adoption order. Others believed it was code. Either way, Laura was different. Emily later testified that Laura had become rebellious. She would whisper to the younger girls at night, telling them that Lillian's rituals were lies, that pain was not holy, that they had to run. One day, she was simply gone. No goodbyes, no farewell, no sign of struggle, just silence. Elena Ruiz, the former nanny, recalled a chilling moment months before she left. "Laura had drawn something and slipped it into my coat pocket," she said. "A picture of the mansion with red crosses over the windows. Underneath it, she'd written, 'They choose who stays. The rest disappear.'" Some believe Laura was the first to be moved to the Indiana property, that she was test subject for a more extreme transference. Others think she escaped and lives under a new identity, too terrified to come forward. But the truth is, Laura was never found. Not her body, not a trace. Just a girl who saw through the illusion and vanished before she could be heard. The lakeside property in Pennsylvania wasn't originally flagged as a key location and in the Ellison investigation. Compared to the Indiana and Michigan sites, it seemed benign. No signs of burial, no scorched floors, just an old retreat house, bought in 1992 under a shell company linked to one of Edward's investment firms. But the devil, as always, was in the basement. Behind a stack of boarded shelving and a false panel, investigators discovered a narrow staircase descending into a windowless room. It was soundproofed, thick padding behind every wall, industrial foam packed into the seams. One bulb dangled from the ceiling. Beneath it, a metal chair bolted to the floor. On one side of the room stood a shelf, dusty, concealed. On it, 9 VHS tapes. Each one was labeled in Lillian's familiar looping script. Transfer, Abigail. Cleansing, Naomi. Vessel number 3, refusal. Ruth, first sign of contamination. No dates, no timestamps, no context. The tapes were handed directly to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Forensic techs reviewed them under controlled conditions, their contents sealed under court order. But those who viewed them, Larson among them, would later speak of the psychological toll. They weren't pornographic, not in the traditional sense. They were worse. Each tape documented what Lillian referred to in her journal as sessions of transference. Long, static shots of the girls reciting incantations, being punished for incorrect posture or eye contact. Sometimes they were silent, other times they were screaming, and in every frame, Edward was there. He stood outside the light, behind the camera, sometimes offering instructions in a voice barely above a whisper, sometimes walking into the frame, adjusting something, setting down a bowl, holding a girl's hand before withdrawing coldly. In one tape, a girl identified as Esther is seen blindfolded, asked to listen to the vessel's cries and tell what has been removed. What followed was 15 minutes of a second girl, unseen, sobbing in a locked room next door. Larson called that tape the most disturbing of all. There was no overt violence, he said. It was psychological torture. It was belief weaponized, and it was completely controlled. The room also contained a locked file cabinet. Inside were childlike drawings, sunsets, trees, angels, and a single folder labeled unworthy. It listed 4 names. 2 matched missing children. The others remain unidentified. The tapes were never made public. The contents too volatile, too damaging, but they confirmed what many feared. The Ellisons weren't just acting on delusion. They were documenting it, systematizing it, turning faith into film. The public outrage that followed the revelations of the Ellison case wasn't just emotional, it was legislative. By the time the final bodies were exhumed and the trial concluded, lawmakers in Ohio and beyond were forced to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. The systems designed to protect children had been outmaneuvered by charm, wealth, and unchecked belief. In late 1997, Ohio Governor Thomas DeWitt signed into law the Ellison Child Protection and Adoption Oversight Act, now known simply as the Ellison Act. It was a sweeping piece of legislation designed to close the very loopholes Edward and Lillian had slipped through so easily. The act did 4 things immediately. 1. Mandated birth documentation. All adoptions in Ohio now required full, verified birth certificates, with DNA confirmation in cases where identity was disputed or unclear. The quiet, backdoor adoptions Edward had arranged through private channels were no longer legally possible. 2. Independent oversight of homeschooling families with adopted children. The Ellisons had hidden behind a curtain of homeschooling. The act established a state-monitored review board that now conducts quarterly wellness checks for any home educating more than 1 adopted child. These reviews include mental and physical health assessments by independent pediatricians. 3. Child welfare transparency, whistleblower protections. Before the act, 7 different complaints against the Ellisons had been dismissed without consequence. Under the new law, any report involving suspected abuse must be documented publicly, anonymously when necessary, and whistleblowers like Dr. Patel or Linda Harper are now protected from retaliation. 4. Cross-state child tracking. Edward had moved children between states, exploiting jurisdictional blind spots. The Ellison Act required a new digital interstate child welfare database, allowing social workers and law enforcement to track movement, name changes, and custody arrangements across all 50 states. But beyond the text of the law, the spirit of it was more haunting. A public acknowledgement that respectability is not proof of safety. Lillian Ellison had passed every background check. Edward had never been charged with a crime. Together, they built a facade so pristine that even trained professionals dismissed signs of abuse. Detective Larson later remarked, "We made it too easy to disappear children. The Ellison Act doesn't fix everything, but it makes hiding them harder." Still, not everyone was satisfied. Survivors' advocates pushed for a federal version of the law. Others argued it didn't go far enough in regulating private religious education, where abuse can fester in isolation. But for the 9 known girls, and the many unnamed, the Ellison Act became something rare, a law written in their memory, a law that says, "We saw you too late, but we will never forget you." In 2002, the town of Willow Creek did something it had never done before. It stopped pretending. For years, locals had whispered about the Ellisons in hushed tones, crossing the street when the mansion was mentioned, averting their gaze when someone brought up the trials. But when the last of the Ellison properties was sold off by the state and the investigation finally declared closed, something shifted. A proposal was made to convert the abandoned northeast field on the edge of town into a place of remembrance, not a playground, not a development, a memorial. It would be called Vessel's Grove, named not in honor of Lillian's terminology, but as a reclamation, a refusal to let that word belong only to horror. At the center of the grove stand 18 trees, 9 maples, 9 pines. 1 for each adopted daughter, 1 for each known vessel. No names are written on plaques. Instead, each tree bears a simple bronze tag etched with a word chosen by survivors and families. Hope, witness, grace, resistance, key, truth, forgiven, endure, free. And the last one, unbroken. A stone path weaves through the grove, ending at a circular clearing where, every year on the autumn equinox, the town holds the Vessel Vigil. Residents gather at dusk, lanterns in hand, as a bell is rung 18 times, once for each child whose life was changed, stolen, or nearly extinguished. The first vigil drew only a few dozen people. The most recent had over 800. Some survivors attend, others watch from afar. A few, like Emily, send in letters to be read aloud anonymously. One of her notes, read in 2018, still hangs on the town's library wall. "You cannot undo what was done, but you can choose to remember. You can choose to believe us when we whisper something's wrong. I no longer live in Willow Creek, but part of me will always walk those halls. Please keep lighting the lanterns. Please don't let us be forgotten." Detective Larson never misses a vigil. He doesn't speak. He just stands near the tree marked "Endure," where the wind moves more slowly than the others, as if even the air has learned to hold its breath. And when the lights go dim and the town falls silent, one voice is always heard, whispered from the crowd year after year. Never again. Not here. Not anywhere. For every name the public learned, Sarah, Emily, Rosa, Maria, Sophia, Aisha, there were others the Ellison case left behind. Names lost to time, names never recorded, children who existed only in fragments of memory, scratched journal entries or shallow graves in unnamed woods. To this day, 4 of the bodies recovered from Ellison properties remain unidentified. They were girls, ages estimated between 6 and 12, buried without clothing, without documentation, without ritual markers. One had a fractured skull. Another had healed burn scars on her legs. Forensics suggested long-term malnutrition, signs of restraint, and prolonged physical trauma. But no fingerprints, no dental records, no matching DNA in missing persons databases. And no one came looking. Investigators believe these children were likely trafficked or kidnapped from highly vulnerable populations, migrant camps, shelters, or rural communities where records were scarce and reporting systems failed. Some may have come from outside the country entirely, smuggled in through private arrangements that Edward, with his network of business contacts, helped facilitate. One chilling passage in Lillian's journal hints at this. 2 new vessels arrived without papers. They are lightless. No past to extract. They will absorb easily. The FBI, in conjunction with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, released age progression sketches of the 4 girls in 2003, hoping someone, anyone, would recognize them. The effort produced hundreds of tips. None panned out. In 2011, following a renewed push led by survivors' advocates, DNA samples from the unidentified victims were added to the International Missing Children Registry. Still, no matches. Even the locations of some remains raise suspicions that more victims are yet undiscovered. One fragment from Lillian's final journal volume includes the words, "The vess, who wouldn't carry, left in the orchard." But no property matching that description was ever found. Robert Harper, now retired, once said in an interview, "There are at least 6 children we're still missing, girls whose faces we'll never know, whose screams were never heard. The Ellisons counted on that, on people not noticing, not asking." Survivors like Emily continue to advocate for a national inquiry into cold cases of missing girls between 1983 and 1996. So far, the calls have not been answered. The question haunts Willow Creek still. How many more were there? And more disturbingly, how many are still missing, hidden under the silence of polite society, as another Ellison smiles from behind the curtain? The Ellison mansion still stands. Perched on the edge of Willow Creek, its grand colonial facade now sits behind a tall iron gate, padlocked and overgrown with ivy. The windows are boarded, the driveway cracked and weathered, and the once manicured hedges now claw at the air like skeletal hands. It has been empty for nearly 3 decades. No buyer ever came forward. Every attempt to sell it was quietly withdrawn. Some say the town simply couldn't bear the thought of someone living inside those walls. Others believe it was cursed in a more practical sense. Unfit, unsafe, unclean. What's left behind inside has been catalogued but never removed. Furniture remains draped in white sheets. Children's shoes sit in a row by the back door. A chalkboard in the schoolroom still bears faint words. Obedience is peace. And on the 2nd floor, in what was once Grace's room, investigators found one message carved into the wall, scratched beneath the windowsill in childlike script. "We are still here. The mansion has become a modern ruin, a place of urban legend. Teenagers dare each other to approach it on stormy nights. Ghost hunters claim to have recorded voices, whispers, sobs, chants. A local historian once snuck inside and emerged pale, refusing to speak for weeks. When pressed, all he said was, 'The silence in there isn't empty, it's waiting.' But for the town, the house represents something worse than ghosts. It is memory, unrelenting, physical, permanent. The town council has debated demolishing it for years. Survivors are split. Some want it gone, to erase the last remnant of their suffering. Others insist it remain, a monument to the darkness that grew behind locked doors no one dared open. In 2020, Emily published a short essay in a survivor's journal. "I don't care if they burn it down or paint it gold. What matters is that people remember what happened inside. That evil isn't always fire and knives. Sometimes it's dinner parties and piano lessons and pretty little dresses. Sometimes it wears pearls. The mansion remains under state ownership, guarded by a rusting chain and a single sign, no trespassing. But those who've been inside say the real warning should read, no forgetting. Because inside those walls, the house still remembers. And so must we. When the Ellison case reached its grim crescendo in the late 90s, much of the world had already turned its attention elsewhere. But Edward and Lillian, the architects of that quiet terror, lived out their final days in vastly different forms of confinement. Lillian Ellison, the woman once seen as the doting social worker turned matron of a ritualized nightmare, was declared legally insane in 1997. Diagnosed with a rare form of schizoaffective disorder compounded by narcissistic delusions, she was remanded to the Greystone Psychiatric Facility in upstate New York under indefinite confinement. Staff describe her as eerily composed. She barely spoke. When she did, it was in fragments, often scripture-like phrases she had written in her journals. She rarely acknowledged her surroundings. But she never resisted her medication or routine. It was as if she accepted her fate as part of her doctrine. Dr. Helen Navarro, one of the last psychiatrists to evaluate her, wrote in her final report, "Lillian does not believe she was caught. She believes the work was completed. Her detachment from guilt is not due to lack of remorse. It's due to belief in the righteousness of her rituals. In her mind, she succeeded." In 2007, during a particularly severe catatonic state, Lillian stopped eating. She wasted away quietly, refusing all attempts at intravenous feeding. Her last days were spent curled in a fetal position, muttering one phrase again and again. "They've carried it. They've carried it away." She died at age 66, alone in her room. Her ashes were never claimed. Edward Ellison, by contrast, remained lucid until the end. Sentenced to 20 years to life under a plea deal, he was incarcerated at Marion Federal Penitentiary under high security. He kept to himself, read extensively, and never spoke publicly about the crimes. In his 8 years behind bars, he never once requested to speak to the survivors. He never wrote a letter of apology. He received monthly visits from a single lawyer and no family. Several inmates claimed Edward believed he was being watched, not by guards, but by the spirits of the unredeemed. Some said he would wake up screaming. Others said he simply stared at the wall for hours, murmuring numbers and names. In 2010, he collapsed during morning roll call. A heart attack. Dead before the ambulance arrived. The funeral home in Ohio refused his body. No next of kin claimed it. He was buried in an unmarked grave on federal prison grounds. In the end, they left the world the way they left their victims, quietly, with questions unanswered. No confession, no remorse, no closure, only the records and the ruin. Willow Creek was once a place you'd forget on purpose. A dot on a map in central Ohio, known only for its summer carnivals, its white-steepled churches, and the kind of people who smiled at you in grocery aisles. But after the Ellison case, it became a name no one wanted to say out loud. Businesses suffered. Reporters lingered. Outsiders drove through slowly, eyes darting toward the Ellison mansion, snapping photos like they were capturing a ghost. For the people who lived there, the notoriety wasn't thrilling, it was shame. They were asked on national television, "How could you not know?" The town's answer, if it ever had one, was swallowed by guilt. In the years after the trial, a strange kind of silence settled over Willow Creek, Some families moved away. Others avoided the topic entirely. The church that once welcomed Edward and Lillian with open arms quietly removed them from historical records. School teachers were instructed not to discuss the events with students unless directly asked. And those who had known the Ellisons best, neighbors, old friends, PTA members, disappeared into their own private revisions of history. But forgetting was never an option. Not when survivors still walked the streets. Not when journalists still made phone calls every September asking for new leads. Not when people like Mary Thompson, a neighbor who once called the Ellisons charming, now spent every Tuesday tending to the maples and pines at Vessel's Grove, whispering apologies under her breath. In 2015, the town attempted to rebrand. They repainted storefronts, hosted a summer moose ice series, and updated the town's slogan from "a place to call home" to "rooted in resilience." But the past lingered. Every new resident eventually heard the story. Every child eventually asked, "What's that house?" And no answer ever satisfied them. A local barista put it best in an anonymous letter published in the Willow Creek Gazette. "We don't talk about it because it hurts, but not talking lets it rot. So here we are, smiling politely while something rotten lives just beneath the sidewalk." Each year, fewer attend the town hall's annual community restoration meeting. Fewer volunteer for the park's upkeep, but the memorial trees still grow, survivors still send letters, and every autumn someone new places a candle on the mansion gate. No name, no note, just a quiet flame that says, "We still remember." Because Willow Creek may try to forget, but the truth never lets go. Not all the girls survived, and those who did weren't the same. Of the 9 adopted Ellison daughters, only 6 remain accounted for today. 3 are presumed dead or missing. All bear deep psychological scars, some visible, some carefully hidden behind changed names, distant towns, and quiet lives. Sarah, the first adopted and once Lillian's chosen, died by suicide in 1999 at just 22. Her note read only, "I did everything right, and it still followed me." Emily, now in her 40s, lives under a new name in the Pacific Northwest. She has spoken only once, anonymously, in a Survivor podcast. Her voice trembled as she recalled the terror of waking each morning not knowing who would be punished next. "We lived in fear of breaking rules we didn't understand. They changed every day. If someone cried, we all suffered. If someone spoke during prayer, we fasted for a week. We learned to disappear while still breathing." She is in ongoing therapy and works with a trauma recovery nonprofit. Abigail was hospitalized multiple times for dissociative episodes. She never spoke again after testifying in 1998. Today, she resides in a long-term care facility outside Dayton. Her doctors describe her condition as permanent psychological fragmentation. She spends her days drawing spirals and geometric symbols, some eerily similar to those found in Lillian's journals. Laura, as previously revealed, disappeared without a trace. Despite extensive efforts, no remains or credible sightings have ever emerged. Naomi became a teacher. Her co-workers know nothing of her past, but she's known to freeze when children scream, to flinch when someone touches her shoulder unexpectedly. And then there are Rosa and Maria Lopez, the 2 girls found malnourished but alive in the attic during the 1996 raid. Now in their 30s, they were reunited with extended family in Arizona. Rosa is entirely mute. Maria speaks haltingly, sometimes forgetting words mid-sentence. She once told a documentary crew, "We were kept in darkness so long, the sun hurt. But what hurt more was when the door opened and no one came in. The state offered counseling. Some took it. Others refused, distrust running too deep. A few married. Some vanished again into new identities. Others still live close by, silently planting flowers near the grove. Their lives now are quiet, but not peaceful. Because trauma doesn't end, it changes shape, it hides, it waits in hallways, it visits in dreams. And yet, in the smallest ways, they endure. One survivor, anonymous in name but not in strength, left a note beneath a tree marked Grace last year. They made us vessels, but we carried more than pain. We carried each other, and that saved us. The Ellison case didn't just fracture a town, it shocked a nation. And while the horror couldn't be undone, it sparked something unexpected: movement. In the years following the investigation, activists, survivors, and legal reformers began to rally around the deeper failures that allowed Edward and Lillian to operate for so long. This wasn't just the story of two disturbed individuals. It was a story of systemic silence, unchecked privilege, and a culture that too often equated wealth with innocence. One of the most vocal efforts to rise from the ashes was the Grace Initiative, a nonprofit named after the fifth Ellison girl. Though Grace was never formally identified among the remains, survivors remember her well: small, bright-eyed, and the one who tried to sneak notes through the air vents. The Grace Initiative now operates in 38 states. Its mission is simple: to monitor and challenge adoption systems, homeschooling networks, and institutional blind spots that enable abuse to flourish behind closed doors. They advocate for independent checks on private adoption agencies, mandatory psychological screening for adoptive parents adopting more than 2 children, tracking systems for interstate movements of wards without certified legal guardianship, expanded funding for trauma recovery in underserved communities. Their founder, Dr. Clara Nguyen, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the Ellison case, speaks openly about the cultural patterns she observed. The Ellisons weren't a cult. They weren't part of some known religious group. What made them dangerous was that they were entirely self-made, two people who wrapped their pathology in ritual and used society's politeness to stay protected. Schools across Ohio began implementing curriculum on invisible trauma, teaching educators how to recognize signs of controlled isolation, language suppression, and ritualized punishment. Law enforcement agencies added the Ellison case to internal training modules on non-traditional abuse dynamics. Even the media changed. For decades, stories of missing children, especially from marginalized communities, were overlooked. After the Ellison victims were revealed to be largely children of color, many undocumented or lost in bureaucratic confusion, a national reckoning began. Today, platforms like Unheard and Silent Faces dedicate themselves to telling stories the news ignored, including those without photos, without names, without easy resolutions. Survivors have become the quiet backbone of this movement. They rarely appear on camera. They don't speak at rallies. But they write. They advocate behind the scenes. They build safe houses. They mentor others who've been trapped in private hells with no witnesses. One message threads through all their work. It doesn't start with monsters. It starts with people who go unquestioned. Among the many horrors uncovered in the Ellison investigation, none offered more insight or more unease than Lillian's journals. There were 12 volumes in total, each bound in hand-stitched leather, with yellowed pages and meticulous handwriting. Some were dated, others not. Some pages were missing, torn out with surgical precision. The rest formed a disturbing blueprint, not of madness, but of belief. These were not diaries. They were doctrines. Lillian referred to her writings as the Transference Codex. In them, she laid out her views on guilt, sin, innocence, and what she called the divine economy of pain. Children, in her framework, were either vessels, born to absorb the rot of the world, or redeemables, those worthy of purification, but only through discipline and submission. Her language was poetic and chilling. She wrote of spiritual weight collecting in the bones of the weak, of cleansing rituals that required silence, starvation, humiliation. She described the girls not as daughters, but as instruments. To love is to cleanse, she wrote. To cleanse is to unmake. Only the child who does not scream can carry the burden. The journals blended fragmented Bible verses with reworded folklore, pseudoscience, and symbols resembling those found in esoteric texts like the Key of Solomon and the Lesser Banishing Ritual. Investigators brought in religious scholars, cult analysts, even anthropologists. No one could tie her writings to any established theology. Dr. Clara Nguyen later said, Lillian created a world no one else inhabited, but she did it so convincingly that others, Edward, the girls, even CPS workers, were drawn into her gravitational pull. Her madness was quiet, literate, reasoned, and that made it lethal. One volume marked with a blood-colored ribbon was the most disturbing. It included illustrations, diagrams of punishment schedules, floor plans of chambers, drawings of children with red X's over their mouths and eyes. And at the end, a single page written in smeared ink, almost illegible, as if written in the middle of a storm. The vessel breaks. The vessel breaks. If the voice is heard, the gate will open. Silence it again. No one knows what gate she meant. Some think it was symbolic, others aren't so sure. The journals were sealed by the court after the trial. Only partial excerpts have been released to researchers under strict guidelines. And yet, copies have surfaced online. Fragments, phrases. Whether leaked or reconstructed, they continue to spread in obscure corners of the internet, discussed in forums, dissected on dark podcasts. And with them comes a chilling possibility that someone else, somewhere, might take her words not as a warning, but as scripture. By the time federal agents finished combing through the known Ellison properties, it was already clear this case had never been confined to a single home or even a single state. 7 properties in total were officially linked to the Ellisons. The Willow Creek Mansion, a farmhouse in Indiana, a cabin in rural Michigan, a lake house in Pennsylvania, 2 storage facilities in Kentucky, and a foreclosed inn in Vermont, purchased under a shell company. But 3 other properties listed under aliases and trust funds connected to Edward's real estate empire remained unsearched, unclaimed, and in legal limbo. One of them, a derelict orchard near the Ohio-West Virginia border, was referenced only once in a torn page from Lillian's journal. The failed vessel lies beneath the blossom field. She would not carry, she would not break. Authorities attempted to locate this site in 2003 UC, among property records, drone surveys, and LiDAR scans. Nothing conclusive was found. But one private investigator, hired by a survivor-led initiative, claims to have discovered an old greenhouse foundation and several shallow man-made indentations in the earth. No bodies were recovered, but the soil bore human DNA. Another property, referred to in Edwards' coded financial ledgers as Well 4, has never been identified. The ledger lists maintenance costs, fencing, and a cryptic entry. Soundproofing complete, East Quarter. Despite FOIA requests and appeals by activists, the original purchase location remains redacted under financial privacy laws. Robert Harper once wrote in his final editorial, "The Ellisons were obsessed with control and with hiding in plain sight." I believe there are more children out there, buried in nameless woods, resting beneath concrete, forgotten by all but the dirt that covers them. Even more disturbing is the discovery of an offshore transaction in 1994, Edward wiring money to a spiritual education center in the Philippines. The center was real. The staff were questioned, but they claimed never to have met the Ellisons. What raised alarm wasn't their denial. It was the Ellison ledger entry. Vessels 14 to 16 prepared, no records. Were there more children? Were they taken overseas? Were they buried deeper than any search has dared to dig? The answers remain elusive. The paper trail ends in firewalls and defunct corporations. Investigators admit that the full scale of the Ellisons' operations may never be known. But survivors continue to push. Because as one of them once said, every property had doors, every door led to another room, and every room held a scream. The Ellison case should have been a turning point. It should have changed the way we vet adoptive parents, the way we listen to children, the way we treat silence, not as peace, but as potential warning. And yet, in many ways, the world moved on, as it so often does, with whispers and discomfort, but not transformation. Ask a teacher in a rural district today how often they see homeschooled children they can't account for. Ask a social worker how many reports get ignored because the accused seem like good people. Ask a child what happens when they speak up, and the adult who's hurting them is the one who holds all the answers. The systems that failed the Ellison children weren't broken by accident. They were built that way, full of blind spots, shields of class, race, wealth, and charm. Lillian Ellison knew this. So did Edward. They didn't operate in the shadows. They operated right in the spotlight, beneath the glowing praise of churchgoers, city officials, and charity hosts. They weaponized perception, and it worked. Detective James Larson reflected on this in a 2018 interview. "We were trained to look for the broken windows, the drunk fathers, the screaming neighbors. But what about the perfect lawn, the quiet piano, the child who smiles a little too hard at every adult?" He paused before finishing. Monsters don't always come out of the woods. Sometimes they host fundraisers. The true horror of the Ellison case isn't the rituals or the journals or even the graves. It's how preventable it was. So many people saw something strange: a teacher, a doctor, a neighbor, a cashier. They wondered, but they didn't push. They assumed, but they didn't ask. They were polite, respectful, afraid of being wrong. But the cost of silence was children whose names we may never know. Today, mandatory reporter laws are stronger in many states. Background checks are more rigorous, but loopholes remain. Entire communities still believe that wealth equals goodness, that niceness means safety, and that bad things only happen far away. The Ellison story, macabre, haunting, and hard to hear, demands a final lesson. Never confuse quiet with harmless. Never mistake piety for purity. And never, ever assume that darkness makes noise. Sometimes it moves silently, behind white curtains. Down locked halls, inside homes with welcome mats. In the end, there are no happy endings here. Only graves. Only questions. Only names, some spoken, some forever lost. Sarah Ellison, Emily, Abigail, Laura, Grace, Naomi, Rosa Lopez, Maria Lopez, Sophia Torres, Aisha Khan, Lila Patel, May Chen, Jamal Carter, and then the unnamed, 4 little bodies, unclaimed by the world, buried in numbered plots. No parents to grieve them, no birthdays remembered, only the fragments of their final days, pieced together by strangers who came too late. We don't know what songs they liked, what dreams they had, if anyone ever held them gently before the darkness swallowed their names. But we do know this: they were not forgotten, not entirely, not anymore. Every year someone lights a candle at Vessel's Grove. Every year a survivor pens a letter, signs it with initials, and places it beneath the tree marked Hope. Every year someone new hears their story and says, "How could this happen?" And maybe that's how it starts, not with closure, but with witnessing, with remembering the truth no one wanted to face, that evil doesn't always wear horns or hide in shadows. Sometimes it wears pearls, hosts tea parties, and smiles at your children from across the street. The Ellisons fooled everyone, because people wanted to be fooled, because suspicion is uncomfortable, because politeness is easier than confrontation, because when the abuser looks like a model citizen, the burden shifts to the child to prove the unbearable. But they shouldn't have to. So we say the names, we tell the story, we keep the lights on. And for the ones who never got to grow old, we offer this promise: you were real, you mattered, and we will never look away again. If you or someone you know suspects a child is in danger, call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST. Let this not be another horror we remember too late. Let this be the reason someone is saved.